I never thought my life would spiral into such chaos, especially over something so personal. I'm a 36-year-old woman, married for nearly a decade. My husband and I started out passionately in love, but over the years that spark has faded. Life got busy, and our connection felt less like a partnership and more like two people coexisting under the same roof. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. Work stress, routines, and the daily grind chipped away at what we had. But still, the void was there, growing silently, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. That's when my nephew came to stay with us. He's my sister's son, 19 years old, polite and respectful. He's the kind of kid every family is proud of, focused on his studies, well-mannered, and mature beyond his years. He needed a place to stay during his internship, and my husband suggested he move in with us for a few months. First, it seemed like a great idea. It broke the monotony of our quiet home, and I welcomed the company. Having him around was refreshing in some ways. He'd bring up random topics at dinner, share funny stories from his day, and even helped out with small chores. But underneath it all, I was struggling. My marriage felt hollow, and I found myself sinking into a pit of loneliness I didn't know how to climb out of. Nights became the hardest. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, craving some form of intimacy, something to remind me that I was still desired, still human. One evening, my husband was working late, as usual. The house was eerily quiet, except for the faint sound of the TV playing in the living room. My nephew was watching something, probably unwinding after his long day. I was upstairs in our bedroom, feeling restless and isolated. It wasn't unusual for me to seek solace in moments of privacy, and that night was no different. I locked the door, dimmed the lights, and allowed myself a rare moment of vulnerability. As I gave in to the temporary comfort of escaping my thoughts, I let my guard down completely. The world outside my room ceased to exist for those brief minutes. Or so I thought. What I hadn't realized was that in my distraction, I hadn't locked the door properly. And just as I was beginning to relax, the door creaked open. My heart stopped. Standing there was my nephew, frozen in place, his wide eyes reflecting shock and confusion. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in that moment. Neither of us moved, both too stunned to react. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. My brain raced, desperately trying to piece together a way to undo what had just happened. But there was no going back. Before I could say anything, he quickly muttered, "I'm so sorry," and backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. What had I just done? I sat there, frozen, the sound of the door clicking shut still echoing in my ears. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and humiliation. What had just happened? How could I have been so careless? My body felt heavy with shame, and my stomach churned at the thought of what he must think of me now. This wasn't just a simple mistake. This was something I couldn't erase or take back. I pulled myself together enough to get dressed, but my hands were trembling, and my heart wouldn't stop racing. I wanted to rush downstairs and apologize, explain somehow, but what could I even say? Every scenario I ran through in my head sounded absurd or made the situation worse. I didn't know if he was angry, disgusted, or just confused. The idea that he might tell someone, my sister, my husband, or even worse, the rest of the family, left me feeling sick to my core. The walls seemed to close in around me as I sat there, paralyzed by the weight of what had just unfolded. Eventually, I forced myself to leave the room. I couldn't hide forever. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and went downstairs. My nephew was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV, but it was obvious he wasn't paying attention. His posture was stiff, and his eyes darted toward me for the briefest second before he quickly looked away. The tension in the room was suffocating. I tried to act normal, forcing a casual tone as I asked if he needed anything or wanted a snack. My voice wavered slightly, betraying my attempt at nonchalance. He shook his head and muttered something about being fine. His body language screamed discomfort, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap that had suddenly formed between us. Every second felt unbearable, but I couldn't bring myself to leave either. I hovered awkwardly, pretending to straighten up the living room, desperate to find a way to address the situation without making it worse. Finally, he broke the silence. "I didn't mean to. I thought you weren't home," he said, his voice low and hesitant. His words were like a knife to my chest. I wanted to apologize, to explain, but I could barely get the words out. All I could manage was a shaky, "It's okay. It was just a misunderstanding." But we both knew it wasn't that simple. The look on his face told me he was struggling to process what had happened, and I didn't know how to help him, or myself. He nodded quickly, like he wanted to end the conversation as soon as possible, and stood up. "I think I'm just going to head to bed," he said, avoiding eye contact as he made his way toward the stairs. I didn't stop him. Couldn't. All I could do was sink into the couch, bury my face in my hands, and replay the moment over and over again in my mind, knowing there was no easy way out of this. The next morning was even worse. The house was unnervingly quiet, as if both of us were deliberately avoiding any unnecessary noise, hoping to erase the memory of the previous night. I stayed in my room longer than usual, trying to gather the courage to face him. My thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and uncertainty. What if he couldn't let it go? What if he couldn't even look at me anymore? The weight of those questions felt unbearable, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. When I finally came downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, silently eating his breakfast. He looked up briefly when I entered but quickly turned his attention back to his plate. The tension between us was palpable, and I could feel my chest tightening with every passing second. I busied myself making coffee, trying to act normal, but the silence was deafening. Every word I wanted to say caught in my throat, and the longer I hesitated, the worse it felt. I tried to break the ice with a casual remark about the weather, but it came out forced and awkward. He responded with a polite nod, keeping his answers short and avoiding eye contact. It was painfully clear that he was uncomfortable, and I couldn't blame him. I felt like an intruder in my own home, tiptoeing around him, desperate to ease the tension but utterly clueless about how to do it. As the day went on, I found myself watching him from a distance, analyzing his every move, looking for any sign of what he was thinking. Was he angry? Embarrassed? Or worse, did he feel like he couldn't trust me anymore? The thought of damaging our relationship, or his trust in me, was unbearable. But every time I thought about addressing it, I froze. What could I even say? How do you fix something like this? Later in the afternoon, there was a moment where it seemed like he might bring it up. I was in the living room, pretending to read, when he hesitantly approached. He stood there for a moment, fidgeting with his hands before saying, "About last night." My heart leapt into my throat, and I felt a wave of panic and relief all at once. But before I could respond, he quickly added, "It's fine. You don't have to explain." His voice was calm but distant, as though he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I wanted to push further, to apologize and make sure he truly understood it was a mistake, but the look on his face stopped me. He didn't want to talk about it. Not now, maybe not ever. And I realized that forcing the issue might only make things worse. So I nodded and gave him a weak smile, murmuring, "Okay, thank you." It felt inadequate, but it was all I could manage. For the rest of the day, we continued to coexist in this strained silence, both of us pretending everything was normal. But beneath the surface, I could feel the distance growing, a barrier that neither of us knew how to break. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind. No matter how much I tried to push it aside, the reality of what had happened wouldn't leave me. The guilt gnawed at me, but there was something else I couldn't quite identify. A lingering tension, a sense that things weren't as resolved as I wanted to believe. I kept wondering what he was thinking, whether he was still as unsettled as I was, or if he'd managed to move past it entirely. I heard faint footsteps in the hallway, and for a moment my chest tightened. Was he heading to the kitchen? His room? Or was he standing outside my door, hesitating like I was? I shook the thought away, trying to convince myself that I was overthinking everything. But the uncertainty lingered, making it impossible to sleep. The next morning he was quieter than usual, which only added to the unease. He avoided the kitchen while I was there and seemed to deliberately keep his distance. I wanted to believe it was just awkwardness that would pass with time, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't something that could be fixed with avoidance or small talk. Later, when he finally spoke to me, his tone was different, measured, careful, as though he were trying to gauge my reaction. "I haven't told anyone," he said, his words landing like a hammer. "I wouldn't do that to you." For a second, relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a sinking feeling. His choice of words carried weight, and I could tell there was more he wasn't saying. "Thank you," I said softly, unsure of what else to offer. But he didn't leave. He lingered there, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger or judgment. It was something closer to curiosity or even hesitation. "Can I ask you something?" he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. I nodded, bracing myself. Was it because of him? My uncle? The question caught me off guard, but I knew what he meant. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. "It's complicated," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. It felt like the first honest thing I'd said in days. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he should, and for a moment there was silence between us. Then, without looking at me, he said, "You don't have to explain. Get it." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that lingered long after he walked away. As I sat there, alone with my thoughts, I realized how deeply the lines had blurred between us. I wasn't sure what would come next or if we'd ever truly recover from this. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.